Hello, my name is Sarah, and I'm reading a ghost story called Secret City by Jan Andrew Henderson. This is chapter 8, The Descent. Charlie felt as if he'd slept for hours, even though it was still dark. Perhaps he had, for now he was wide awake and itching to get up and do something. He put on his shoes, stuffed the diary inside his shirt, and went to the window. The old town was hunched in the middle of Edinburgh like a sleeping dragon, a heavy moon gilding its jagged outline. Charlie looked at his watch. It's 4:30 in the morning. He unlatched the window and stuck his head out. There was a drain pipe a couple of feet to the left, but his room was on the second floor and it was too dark to tell whether the garden below was grass, soil or paving. Yet suddenly he wanted to know. In fact, he wanted to know everything. And not just know everything, but feel everything too. For it was the closest he would come to describing it. For the first time, Charlie Wilson really wanted to be part of the adventure, rather than just a spectator. Almost without thinking, he pulled himself onto the broad window ledge and twisted round to grasp the drain pipe in both hands. He had never actually watched his parents practice their high wire act, but he remembered how they moved in the routines that he'd seen. And he recalled his father saying that hesitation was an acrobat's worst enemy. With a deep breath, Charlie swung one foot over the pipe and planted it against the wall, took his other foot off the windowsill and began to climb down, hand over hand. A minute later, he was standing on the dark, dewy grass, not even out of breath. This was better than a video game, he said brightly, letting himself out of the garden gate and heading towards the old town. Edinburgh Festival's events went on until around 1 in the morning and the pubs closed even later. But at this hour, even the most hardened partygoers had gone to bed, and the streets were deserted as Charlie made his way up the high street and onto the castle esplanade. Far below, the lights of Edinburgh glittered like a swarm of fireflies, but the castle was a soaring block of darkness, casting a net of shadows over the esplanade and turning monuments and trees into sinister blobs. Charlie felt as though he was standing on another world. Then the first rays of dawn began to filter through the tall tenements on the Royal Mile, spotting the castle ramparts with light and laying golden strips along the esplanade. They lit a low bordering wall and Charlie went and sat on the ground with his back against it. As the minutes ticked by, the castle slowly turned from black to charcoal to grey, and then the boy could make out the outlines of statues, railings and ticket booths. Eventually, it was light enough to read, and he opened Piesel's diary. The tunnel was at the back of the darkest, deepest dungeon, and there was hardly room for even a boy of a small size to fit inside. I held the firebrand in front of me with one hand and dragged the drum behind me on a leather strap tied to my waist. The officer had instructed me to stop every few minutes or so and bang the drum as loudly as I could, so that he could hear where I was going, but this proved to be more difficult than he imagined. The firebrand spluttered badly, and the narrowness of the tunnel deflected the heat back into Piesel's face. He was forced to hold the torch as far in front of him as he could and crawl using his free arm. The leather strap attached to the drum kept getting tangled in his legs, and the only way that he could make a noise was to stop crawling and kick at the drum's taut skin with his foot. The councilmen and the soldiers at the entrance of the tunnel waited until the erratic banging was so faint that they could hardly hear it. "Sergeant," the officer said finally, "take some men and scour the main courtyard. See if they can pick up the noise and put some out on the esplanades too." "Yes, sir!" The sergeant stood to attention, then hesitated. "Begging your pardon, sir, but that drum the lad's dragging behind him fills the entire tunnel. If it comes to a dead end, how's he going to get back?" "This is a military garrison," the officer gave the sergeant a withering look. "We can't just have tunnels running who knows where. We need to know where it goes." So he turned and he walked away. Wriggling along the tiny passageway, Piesel was soon close to exhaustion. The firebrand in front of him was burning precious oxygen. What air he could suck into his straining lungs was hot and thin, and his elbows and his knees throbbed where the rough stone had torn away at his skin. Worst of all, he was gripped by a rising panic It was becoming harder and harder to quell. He wanted to scream in rage and fear and thrash at the walls, but he knew that this would use up even more air. Instead, he forced himself to lie still until he felt a semblance of calm return. Then he began to crawl forward once more. Finally, when the pickpocket had almost given up hope, the little passage began to widen. Soon Peasle could crawl on his hands and knees, then managed a crouching shuffle, and then, finally, he was able to stand. He put the torch on the ground, fastened the drum properly around his waist, untied the drumstick strapped to his thigh. On the castle esplanade, Private McSorry sat on a low wall, smoking a pipe. "McSorry!" roared the sergeant. "I know the boy's probably dead already, or the extremities are being eaten by rats, but that doesn't mean you can give up looking." He stopped suddenly and held up a large scarred hand. "What's that?" "What's what?" "Silence, you horrible little man!" the sergeant screamed. "How am I supposed to concentrate with you whittering on?" He dropped to his knees, pressed a hairy ear to the ground. "That's drumming, Private, that's what it is, under the ground." He looked up, moustache quivering, beckoned to the officer. "Sir, over here!" Peasle marched along the tunnel, firebrand raised high. Occasionally he stopped and beat the drum for a few seconds, but not very often, for the sound was deafening in such an enclosed space. The boy was wary of making a loud noise at the best of times, for pickpockets, out of sheer habit, didn't like to attract unwanted attention. But who knew what was lurking in the passageways? However alarming the drumming was, Peasle was far more disconcerted by the fact that the tunnel had begun to slope steeply down. Now, with every turn, he was moving deeper into the bowels of the earth. Then he came to a door. It was ancient and thick, its misshapen oak timbers covered in dark mould. Peasle groaned in disbelief. What on God's green earth is this doing here? Must be a ton, and I'll wager its hinges are rusted solid with age. He gave it a half-hearted shove at the giant oak. I bet Goliath himself couldn't shift it. The door swung open without a sound, and Peasle fell through into another passage. The barrier shut again, and the pickpocket sprang to his feet, swiping wildly in the air with his drumsticks and screaming, but no hidden monster appeared. And this tunnel looked the same as it did on the other side of the door. Regaining his composure, Peasle turned and inspected the barrier more closely. The torch lit up the hinges, ornate, finely crafted, and looked as if they had been made yesterday. "No wonder they didn't rust," the pickpocket breathed. "If I'm not mistaken, they're solid silver, finer than any snuff box I've ever seen." He ran his torch excitedly over the rest of the door and found that its surface was pitted with metal studs, glowing with a flickering beauty, and they too were silver. Peasle grabbed a narrow rock and tried with all his strength to prise one off, but the stud stayed put. Damn! The pickpocket finally gave up. "Don't suppose there's much chance of stumbling on a crowbar?" He stepped back and studied the door with a growing suspicion. Why anyone would go to the trouble of building such an ornate barricade way down here, then making it so easy to get through? His eyes widened, unless it only opens from one side. The pickpocket launched himself at the door and pushed with all his might. Didn't budge. He tried pulling on the silver studs, but his hands just slipped off. "Blast, blast, blast!" he sobbed, and attacked the door again, but he already knew in his heart that it was useless. He gave the unyielding wood one last kick, picked up the firebrand, and continued, still cursing, down the tunnel. But the unpleasant surprises weren't over, for before long the tunnel forked. Peasle stopped and stared at the identical passageways. "Oh, both of these probably lead to certain death, so it doesn't matter which one I take," he muttered. And he went left. But after a while the tunnel split again, and then again, and every few minutes he had to make a fresh choice. Peasle tried to pick the passages that didn't slope too much, but each corridor twisted and turned and led downwards. Desperation eventually overcame fear, and as the boy marched, he began to beat the drum, berating himself with each stroke for agreeing to this insanity. He would probably keep descending until he died from thirst or reached Australia after all. Then he turned a corner and stopped dead. Once again, the passageway split in different directions, but this time the left-hand passage opened into a large chamber. It seemed to have suffered a rockfall. On one side of the vault's boulders, there rose a steep angle from the floor almost to the roof. The pickpocket's mouth fell open and the drumsticks fell unnoticed from his hands. Scattering across the sloping hill of stones was a mass of breastplates and helmets, while swords, spears and arrows protruded from between the large rocks. They glowed coldly in the firebrand's light, and Peasel could tell at a glance that the weapons and the armour, like the door studs, were made of solid silver. The pickpocket was looking at more wealth than he could ever have imagined. And he could imagine a lot of wealth. He clambered onto the rockfall and ran trembling hands over the shiny surfaces. "This is the best thing that has ever happened to me," he sighed, laying his cheek reverently on a gleaming breastplate. "Now I really do have to get out of here alive." He cast an expert eye over the treasure until he spotted what he was sure was the finest piece. Near the ceiling, a beautifully engraved sword with a jewel-encrusted handle was wedged between two boulders. The pickpocket scrambled to the top, grasped the handle and pulled with all his might. The sword slid out of the narrow gap, astonishingly light in his hand and smouldering with a steely blush that seemed to come from within. "This one will do nicely." Peasel climbed back down the rock pile, the drum banging awkwardly against his knees. With a grunt, he unfastened a clasp on the leather strap, and the drum crashed to the ground and rolled off down the tunnel. Peasel fastened the sword in its place, picked up the firebrand, and set off down the open passage, whistling to himself. Now that he was carrying a weapon worth a fortune, the pickpocket was filled with a newfound enthusiasm. Halfway down the Royal Mile, the sergeant took his ear from the ground and slowly stood up. On one side of his head, matted with mud, it was sticking out like a small explosion. The councillors and the officer looked at him expectantly. The drumming kept getting fainter, sir, like the boy was getting further and further underground." The sergeant took a deep breath, and then it stopped. There was silence for a few seconds before the officer turned to the councillors. "Doubt very much if we have found an escape tunnel or a secret entrance to the castle, if it just goes down that far." He turned to the sergeant. "Just to be on the safe side, order the men back to the dungeons and have them seal the passage up again." Begging pardon, sir." The sergeant looked flustered, for he was not used to questioning his superiors. "Just because the drum stopped doesn't mean the boy's dead." "No, indeed, sergeant." The officer tapped an ivory-topped cane angrily against his leg. "But my priority is the defence of the castle, not the fate of some thief." He quickly turned his back, indicating that their brief conversation was over. "Hiya! The sergeant motioned to McSorry and his companions to follow and marched purposely back up the high street. He'd seen children die before. The drummer boy of his own regiment had been swept away in a French cannon blast at the Battle of Osterstad. He didn't approve, of course, but orders were orders. Charlie opened his eyes. The whole of the esplanade was bathed in the early morning sunlight, and the brass statues that lined the sides were shining like precious metal. "Breastplates and helmets and swords," the boy breathed softly, "all solid silver and encrusted with jewels." He remembered Lily's words when he'd first shown her the note. "I bet it means there's treasure hidden down there." "Phew, you said it, girl," laughed Charlie, shutting the diary. Then the laugh died in his throat as he recalled what she had said next. What if those council workers are heading towards it? Charlie sprang to his feet and raced down the high street towards the big top. Oh, but good grief! I hope Peasel's going to be okay 200 years ago. Anyway, I hope that you have been washing your hands, cleaning your teeth, and now you're snuggled up in your bed to give yourself a great big huge cuddle because you deserve it. Night, night, and I will see you tomorrow.